It's been 40 years since Moses was commissioned by the Lord to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, which happened when he was already 80 years old. It's an understatement to say that there were some very difficult moments along the way, such as persuading Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Pharaoh only agreed after suffering plagues and deaths in Egypt. There was the crossing of the Red Sea when being chased by Pharaoh's army. There was the provision of food and water for 2,400,000 people. There was the surprise attack by the Amalekites. There was the building of the golden calf to worship in place of God. The negative report by 10 of the 12 spies sent into Canaan that led to nobody over the age of 20 at that time being allowed to enter the promised land. And then there are all of the laws passed down from God to Moses as recorded in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. There's the census that's recorded in the book of Numbers. And as I said, all this happened after Moses was 80 years old. Now he's approaching 120 years of age and was probably looking forward to entering the promised land along with the Israelites. And yet, although Moses is one of the most honoured men in the Jewish faith, in the Christian faith, one of only two other people who appeared with Jesus at the Transfiguration, Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land. What happened? Why was he denied what he could be considered his reward for leading the Israelites for 40 years? This is what I'm going to be looking at this week. And it starts once again with the people complaining. One of the significant characteristics of this journey to the promised land was that the people complained over and over again. If it wasn't about food, then it was about water to drink. If it wasn't about water, it was about safety. If it wasn't about safety, it was about the danger and risk of moving into Canaan, believing that the land was full of giants. And now the Israelites are complaining again and bringing up the same arguments. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 to 11. Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now, there was no water for the congregation. So they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink." So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. So, once again, the Lord has provided what was needed at the time it was required. Now, as I said, this incident has happened in the 40th year after the Israelites had left Egypt. It's been 40 years of living a nomadic life. For Moses, it has been 40 years of leading a group of people who have been constantly moaning. Now, during the time when I worked, I managed several different teams. And in some of those teams, there were people who were constantly moaning, usually about me. It was mentally tiring to be always moaned at and having to address what the team members were complaining about. And the teams I led were no larger than 20 people. That's nothing compared to 2,400,000 that made up the Israelites. It's also worth noting at the beginning of this reading that it says that Miriam had died. Miriam was the older sister of Moses and Aaron, and was the lady who had stayed and watched the infant Moses being placed in the basket on the River Nile back in Egypt. She also led the women of Israel in celebration after the crossing of the Red Sea. The death of his sister, who must have been well over 120 years old, would have been emotionally distressing for Moses, loss of a sibling. And now we come to the central reason for Moses not entering the promised land. There was a shortage of water again, as I've said, and the old arguments came out again. Why have you, meaning Moses, brought us into this wilderness? It seems that they had forgotten that the reason why they were in the wilderness in the first place was because of the people's lack of faith back when the spies had returned from the scouting mission into the promised land. Then came the other complaint that had been used over and over again during the last 40 years. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? We had all that we needed there. Again, they seem to have forgotten that the Lord brought them out of Egypt because they'd been crying out to the Lord to be delivered from their captivity. Now, sometimes we can be guilty of demonstrating selective memory. We can pray to the Lord to be delivered from a situation and be thankful when the Lord does deliver us, only for us later down the line to start complaining about the situation that we've been delivered into. The Israelites also seem to have forgotten that the Lord had been providing food and drink for 40 years. However, in response to the pleas for water, Moses and Aaron went yet again, as they had done over the years, before the Lord to ask for water to provide it. The Lord spoke to them and told Moses and Aaron to speak to the rock, and water would come forth. Moses and Aaron went back before the people and spoke to them. He struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out, and all the people and all the animals all had enough to drink. So as I said, once again, the Lord had provided. But if we then move on into verse 12 of Numbers chapter 20, then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. So what's happened here? How have Moses and Aaron not believed God? For the answer, we have to go back to verses 7 and 8 of the earlier passage. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod you and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals." Here, the Lord commands Moses to speak to the rock, and it will yield water. Yet when we look at verse 11, we read that Moses struck the rock twice with his rod. Water still came forward, but not as a result of the action the Lord had said they should do. So why did Moses strike the rock instead of speaking to it? Well, certainly Moses was angry. We see this in verse 10 when Moses begins speaking to the Israelites by saying, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" So we can imagine how Moses must have felt. 40 years of being moaned at. He may have been still upset over the death of his sister. The Israelites probably knew about this, but they still moaned about him. His anger may be considered justified on his part, but it was still anger. And when we become angry, we do not always act in a considered manner. Back in Exodus chapter 17, Moses had struck a rock at Horeb and water had flowed out. Maybe he was thinking because water had come from striking a rock back then, that all he had to do this time was strike the rock. It worked before, why shouldn't it work now? But that is not what God told Moses to do. He was told to speak to the rock. Nothing was mentioned about striking it. The lesson to take from this point is that God is not tied down to answer our pleas, our prayers, in the way he may have answered them before. Just because God achieved something in the past by one method, it does not mean he will achieve the same thing a second time by the same method. We have to listen to what the Lord tells us. Moses did not do this, and as a result was barred from the promised land because he disobeyed God. What this teaches us is that obedience in the details matter. The end result may have been the same in that water was provided, but it was not how the Lord intended. Striking a rock with a rod could have caused water to flow without any intervention from God. After all, isn't it possible that by striking a rock, it would cause the rock to split apart and reveal a hidden pool or spring below? Nothing supernatural about that. People may have doubted that the Lord had been the reason that water was provided before. Speaking over a rock involves no physical action of any kind and demonstrates the power of the Lord. Speaking over a rock and water starting to flow is certainly supernatural. This would have served as further evidence that the Lord was providing for the Israelites. But Moses, striking the rock with his rod, took away that lesson. There are two other lessons that this episode shows us. It shows us that leaders are held to higher standards of reflecting God's character. What example did this action demonstrate to the people? Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. Because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I had given them. Both Moses and Aaron failed to honor God in the sight of the Israelites. Moses allowed his personal anger to misrepresent God's character to the people by acting out of turn. As a leader, this was not an acceptable example. The greater the leader, the more exacting the standard set by God. I mean, James chapter 3 verse 1 has a warning about becoming a leader. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. Now, please, don't think that as a leader in this church, I'm trying to gain your sympathy. I'm simply trying to look into how a leader, any leader in a church, should conduct themselves. The other lesson that this episode shows us is that impulsive actions can carry permanent consequences. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Let me say that again. Partial obedience is still disobedience. God told Moses to take his staff, gather the community, and speak to the rock. Moses took the staff, but instead of speaking as instructed, struck the rock in frustration. Doing only part of what God asks us to do is not full obedience. God expects us to follow his instructions to the letter, exactly as he says. Substituting our own methods when frustrated undermines his commands and authority. Moses let his exasperation with the grumbling Israelites override his trust in God's power. By striking the rock, he relied on past methods instead of the new divine command to simply speak. Faith is proved by action, but when reverting to human intuition rather than following God's specific word, it demonstrates a lapse in faith and a reliance on self-effort. The central point of this incident is to highlight. Let me start that again. The central point of this incident is to highlight that it has always been and always will be the Lord's work. Personally, I am wary of many of the preachers and teachers today who use their names to attract people to hear them. Now, I'm not claiming that it's true in every case, but when you see adverts proclaiming the name of speakers at a conference or major event, I do wonder how many people are going along to hear the Lord or to hear the advertised speaker. I mean, Jello, I think, made a similar point last week when in his talk from 1 Corinthians. There is also no guarantee that the Lord will allow any of us to see through to the conclusion any work we may have been involved in. The work is always continuing, and the Lord will always put in place those best placed to carry out that work. So we shouldn't think for a moment that any of us are so important to the work that it will end when we stop being involved. The mistake many church leaders make is that they see themselves as vital to the work for it to continue into the future and find it difficult to let go and to pass on to somebody else. Simply put, that's pride at work. For Moses, there were consequences for his actions, as we've read in verse 12. He and Aaron would not bring the assembly into the land which the Lord had given them. Now, it's worth noting here that it wasn't only Moses who wasn't allowed to enter the promised land, it was Aaron as well. Aaron may not have been the main figure, but he stood with Moses and in the eyes of the Lord was equally to blame for the disobedience. We have to recognize that poor choices and actions based on our emotions can carry lasting and unchangeable repercussions. Of course, God remains loving and faithful to forgive us our sins, but there will be consequences for our actions. And for Moses and Aaron, the consequence was that they were not permitted to enter into the promised land. Moses wrote some more about this incident in his last book. The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth and final book written by Moses. It was written in his final years whilst the Israelites were on the plains of Moab before entering the promised land. And in the book, Moses summarizes the history, he restates the law, and outlines the blessings of obedience and consequences of disobedience. The name Deuteronomy can be translated as repeated law. And the book is a reminder for the new generation of Israelites before they embark on the next stage of their journey. So in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 23 to 28, Moses talks about why he was not allowed to enter the land. Then I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do anything like your works and your mighty deeds? I pray, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. So the Lord said to me, enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift your eyes towards the west, the north, the south, and the east. Behold it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan. But command Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over this before this people, and he shall cause them to inherit the land which you will see. The last 3 chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses commissions Joshua as his successor. He recites a final song, and then he blesses the tribes of Israel. And chapter 34, the last chapter in the book of Deuteronomy, describes the death of Moses. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of the palm trees as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he, that is God, buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But since then, there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. In all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Moses is still to this day held in the highest esteem for carrying out the Lord's work in leading the Israelites out of Egypt. But his role ended on the borders of the Promised Land. The Lord allowed him to stand on Mount Nebo to look upon the land, but that was the point at which he laid down his work. Joshua was appointed to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, and we know from the book of Joshua that it was not an easy task. There were battles, there were wins and losses and deaths. In other words, the work moved on into a new phase, a phase that Moses was not involved in. So, how to summarize the life of Moses? He lived the first 40 years of his life as a man with a foot in each of two worlds. He was a Hebrew by birth, but raised in the luxury of the palace of Pharaoh. This gave him the perspective needed to negotiate with Pharaoh, but also maintained the empathy needed to lead his own people. He was an emotional man. He had sympathy for the plight of the Israelites in Egypt. Because he was raised in Pharaoh's household, Moses was an intelligent man. He was well educated. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He organized the Israelites. Yet, although he had these talents, he was unsure of himself. He was a reluctant leader. From the encounter with the Lord at the burning bush, he tried to get out of his calling, claiming his lack of eloquence and that he was unworthy. But this was exactly what the Lord needed. Someone who knew they could not carry out the Lord's instructions in their own strength, so that when he had to face Pharaoh, he did so in the Lord's strength. We sang earlier, didn't we? Let the weak now say, I am strong. Moses demonstrated that true authority comes from God rather than human strength. The Lord used Moses as his instrument to perform miraculous deeds, such as the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of food and water. Moses was an intercessor. He stood before God and a rebellious and grumbling people. Moses pleaded for forgiveness for the people before God when they lost faith in the wilderness. In short, he was a leader appointed by the Lord. But he was also a flawed man. He lost his temper when he saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite, and such was his anger that he killed him. As a result, he had to flee Egypt and spend 40 years as a shepherd. He lost his temper when the Israelites complained again, as we read about earlier. In short, he was like you and me. He was human. And because of his disobedience to God, even though it was only disobeying in a small way, but because of that, Moses had to face the consequences and was not allowed to enter the Promised Land. But even though Moses wasn't permitted to enter the land, he is still honoured to this day. What greater honour can there be than to have been seen alongside Jesus at the Transfiguration? This means that Moses certainly entered heaven when he died. How could this be when he disobeyed God? The answer lies in the sovereign grace of God. As we read in Deuteronomy 34, Moses knew and accepted the reason for not being allowed to enter the Promised Land. He knew that he had sinned and he accepted the consequences. The Bible doesn't specifically state that Moses asked God for forgiveness, but when we read these verses, we can see it is a man who is at peace with God. And so we come to the end of the life of Moses, a man used greatly by the Lord, a man who is an example of the Lord's strength working through a person, a man who had his flaws and suffered the consequences for his actions, but a man ultimately reconciled with God, who now holds a position of honour. A man whose life is an example of what to do and what not to do. But in the end, it's the life of a man who loved the Lord and made sure he was right before the Lord at the end of his life. The Lord takes ordinary people and works through them to do extraordinary work. I repeat what I said earlier. The work has always been and always will be the Lord's. He takes flawed people like Moses to show the Lord's strength. In the end, it comes down to our obedience and our making ourselves available to the Lord. Moses is one example of someone who did that. And I hope that I've shown that really he was no different to you or I. And the question I want to leave with us all today, and really for you to answer for yourself, am I willing to be obedient to the Lord and make myself available to him as Moses did? Lord bless you.